Today, the Akron Roundtable is pleased to host David Greene, host of NPR's Morning Edition, whose presentation is entitled A Perspective from NPR's Morning Edition host, David Greene. I will now ask Dan Skinner, Executive Director and General Manager of WPSU 89.7 FM and board member of the Akron Roundtable, to introduce our presenter. Dan?
For listeners to public radio, David Greene is a familiar voice. In fact, many of you wake up every morning to the sound of his voice on 89.7 WKSU, because David is the co-host of Morning Edition along with Steve Inskeep and Renee Montagne. Now, David's credentials as a journalist and the range of his experience is so extensive that I really can't relay all of it right now, but here are some of the highlights. For 2 years prior to taking his current role in 2012, David was an NPR foreign correspondent based in Moscow, covering the region from Ukraine and the Baltics east to Siberia. He also spent a month reporting from Libya as the NATO bombs fell on Tripoli. For 4 years, David covered the White House for NPR, and during the course of that time, he trekked across 5 continents reporting on White House visits. Before joining NPR in 2005, he spent nearly 7 years as a reporter for the Baltimore Sun. And before graduating magna cum laude from Harvard in 1998 with a degree in government, he worked as a senior editor on the Harvard Crimson. He's also the author of the book Midnight in Siberia, which chronicles his 6,000-mile journey on the Trans-Siberian Railway. Now, through his work as a journalist and host of NPR's Morning Edition, David Greene brings you a global view of the news, but the story doesn't end there. It turns out that sharing the world with others is a family trait. After traveling with David and visiting over 30 countries, David's wife, Rose, took that experience and used it as inspiration to create a new restaurant in Washington, D.C. The restaurant is called Compass Rose, and it features international street food. So when you think of this, together, both in their own way, David and Rose have dedicated themselves to feeding our mind, body, and souls with fresh international perspectives. Please join me in welcoming David Greene to Akron Roundtable.
Thank you so much for coming out. This is just such a wonderful event. It's an honor to be part of this. I know the list of speakers who have spoken in this forum over the years. It's just an unbelievable tradition and really, really, really humbling to stand at this podium. Deanna, thank you for that introduction, and thank you for bringing up my wife, who's actually sitting with her family right here in the second table from the wall in the front row. She is an unbelievable inspiration. I've accomplished a lot, and I feel really lucky to have done that, but to have watched Rose over the last few years find her dream and realize her calling and follow her passion fearlessly and courageously and open a business that has been such a wonderful gathering spot for a community in Washington that is open to everyone. It's the true center of the neighborhood, and it does feed the minds and bodies and souls of so many people. I'm in awe of what my wife has done, and it's just been inspiring to be married to you and to watch what you've pulled off in these last few years. So I feel really at home in Akron because my wife's family is from here. Many of them are sitting at the table right there, and I understand that Rita Kelly, who is at the table, played a role in me being here. She and Steve were chatting last year about possible speakers, and my name came up, which is very flattering, and Rita just said, "Oh, let me just text him." And so a text message showed up and said, "You gotta come to the Akron Roundtable. This is just something you have to do." And Rita has been played a tremendous role in this community for a long, long time. And so Rita, thank you for bringing me and making this happen. I also wonder if you told everyone that you were inviting a Steelers fan to the Akron Roundtable. I don't know if that was sort of a warning that you should have given. So apologies for that. The Steelers-Browns rivalry comes up very often in our newsroom. Dave Pignanelli is sort of an icon in public radio in Ohio, and he works in our newscast unit now. A diehard Browns fan, and he and I will go at it back and forth almost every day during football season. And anytime he has a chance, he'll sneak into my office and he'll take my Ben Roethlisberger Matrushka doll and he'll stick it head first into a cup of coffee. And so it's just a reminder all the time of sort of that rivalry. But there is really a bond. I sort of call it a sort of sibling bond. Growing up in Pittsburgh and hating the Browns, but also appreciating kind of the pride and the Rust Belt mentality of communities like this, all of which adds to the sense of really feeling at home here. And speaking of this community, WKSU is such a wonderful public radio community. And the people who work there are lucky to have such a supportive community, and this community is really lucky to have the people at WKSU and the work that they do each and every day. I had time last night with some of their staff and some of their supporters. Amanda Rabinowitz is the Morning Edition host who wakes up as early as I do every morning. And it's amazing, I'm a huge fan of hers, and she and I were standing there and it turned out we wore exact same color purple shirt last night. So I really want to bring our social science correspondent, Shankar Vedantam, on and ask him if there's something about sleeplessness that causes you to wear purple. It's very possible. So I want to talk a little bit about the work that I do and my career and my approach and our approach to journalism in this day. I still have to pinch myself sometimes when I think about the job that I have, because being in radio for this former print reporter was really unlikely. And that was very clear in my first days. I came from the Baltimore Sun to NPR and was fortunate to have a mentor, a friend of mine and wonderful colleague, Don Gagne. The two of us covered the White House together. And he gave me a lot of advice about radio and about radio writing and the importance of sound and storytelling. And Don and I shared this tiny little booth in the basement of the West Wing. It was the NPR booth right at the White House. And he took me there the first few days and sort of showing me the ropes. And he said, one thing I want to tell you that a print reporter might not think about, you have to shut this soundproof door to track your stories. But once you're done doing that, you should open the door pretty quickly, because when the door's closed, you don't really know what's going on at all. It's like, okay, got it. I'm gonna put that on my checklist. And my first day covering the White House alone, I was sitting in the booth and I just filed a spot for, what a cool sound. That's sound effects, so that's a real train. That's wild. Wow. So I was covering the White House for the first time by myself, and Don wasn't there. I tracked something, had the door shut, totally forgot to open it. I was sort of watching something on television. I was just taking a moment and being like, wow, I'm covering the White House for NPR. This is really cool. And the phone rang, and it was my editor, Ron Elving, over at our building about 10 blocks away. And he said, Dave, what's happening there? I said, oh, Ron, I'm here. I'm your guy at the White House. Got it all covered. Everything's fine. He's like, well, I have CNN on and the White House was just evacuated. And I said, right, yes it was. Let me go do some reporting and I'll get back to you. And so I opened the door really slowly and it was dark. And there was some security lights flashing and a Secret Service agent was standing there, and I just said, so what's happening? And he said, well, there's a plane that came into White House airspace, and so we've cleared out the building. I was like, so I should go? And he said, well, it's probably safer for you to stay here now. Got it, good, I'll stay here with you, no problem. So I got back on the phone with Ron and tried to make the argument that I was actually better positioned than any reporter who had actually fled the building, which didn't go over that well. So this sort of, things cleared up very quickly and everything was fine, except when you start at NPR as a serious news journalist, the shows that you want to get on are things like Morning Edition and All Things Considered. Not Wait, Wait, Don't Tell Me. But Wait, Wait, Don't Tell Me called and said, hey, we hear you were kind of stuck in the building and didn't leave when it was evacuated. That's kind of funny. Can we have you on? And they played the song Danger Zone by Kenny Loggins. And then Peter Sagal said, there's this building in Washington that was evacuated, but NPR's David Greene was right on it because he did not leave. David, what were you doing in that building? Which was wonderful. But so somehow I climbed from that and over the years into the host chair at Morning Edition, and I'm going to talk a little more seriously about the work we do, but I really do have to pinch myself sometimes because I have just had this tremendous honor in talking to people, musicians and movie stars and presidents. I really do have to pinch myself sometimes because it feels like a dream. And I want to play a little bit of tape. It's about 2 minutes long, and this just gives you a window into my bizarre life. You're going to hear three people. It's three interviews I did: Barry Manilow, Bette Midler, and the R&B group TLC. And who you'll hear gave me a nickname that has just stuck forever, unfortunately. But with Barry Manilow, I'm a big karaoke singer, and he has a song that I have always loved singing karaoke, and so I decided to take a risk when I was talking to him. So here we go. Barry Manilow, you wouldn't fulfill my bucket list and sing a bar to of Mandy with me, would you?
With you?
Yeah. Oh my goodness.
Okay, ready? Oh, Mandy, and you came and you gave without taking, but I sent you away. Oh, Mandy. Oh, you're in tune.
You're very generous. Wow.
That was great.
Thanks. You were great too, Mr. Manilow.
I need you today, oh, Mandy.
Bette Midler jokes about what the headline of her obituary might read. Perhaps diva dies in hot dog mishap, or simply Bette dead. So in 2014, what's the headline you would sort of joke about? Would be how you'd be defined?
I think it would be, she planted 1 million trees in New York City.
This is a very different person compared to the defined mishap.
I do, it's so sad.
Were you tearing up jokingly, or was that?
No, I tear up. I'm like, I cry. Traffic lights.
I apologize for thinking you were joking.
Oh, no.
What struck you there when I said about the defined mishap?
Let's move on from death, shall we? Let's talk about life.
It took some years off, but we're still together. We're always TLC.
Yeah.
Chili T-Buzz, thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate
First of all,
it.
I have to say I love your voice.
Yeah, you have a good voice.
Wow, that's gonna be.
Ooh, it's sexy.
Wow.
Oh, big sexy.
I'm serious. I'm like, dang.
So your new name is Big Sexy.
Yes.
Yeah, my colleagues haven't let me live that down since that moment. If you caught that Bette Midler moment, it was in an interview that I was doing in person in New York City. And interviewing is a much harder skill to kind of pick up than I sort of realized, especially in broadcasts, because you have to listen. And that sounds so easy because it's sort of the foundation of everything we do. But it also means getting rid of so many distractions and impulses to be doing something else in that moment. And in the case of being a host of a radio program, you have a list of questions that you brought, you have a time element. It's like, is Bette Midler's assistant going to come in and make her leave at any moment? What topics do I want to get to? It's so easy to not listen. And if you listen, there can be so many surprises and so much nuance that you might not pick up on if you're too rushed. And in that interview, it was very easy. Bette Midler and I were having fun. We were talking about the Divine Miss M. We were talking about the crazy book she had written about a tour she did several decades ago. But suddenly she did start crying. And I laughed because you could hear, it almost sounded like a bit of her comedy. But, that tear was meaningful. And we ended up chatting after that. And what was revealed was, in my eyes, someone who is kind of having conflict about the image that she had created herself, that she had created for herself, that she wasn't entirely comfortable that the divine Miss M, the Bette Midler we all know, is the one that she wants to present to the world and wants to be her legacy. And that was something that we had not planned for at all. That was not something that my editors and I had talked about. Well, we want to get this out of Bette Midler when we talked to her. And that never would have happened had I not had this lesson in my mind about how important it is to actually give someone the space to speak and to listen, which is a lot harder than I think many of us realize, not just in journalism, but kind of in life. And it's a lesson that I learned and traced back to growing up with my mother, who was an enormous influence on my life. She raised me in Pittsburgh and in Lancaster, Pennsylvania, as a single mom, and she taught psychology at Franklin and Marshall College. She was sort of this big presence on campus, and she walked her dogs across campus, and sort of everybody knew her. And she really had this approach to life that everyone has a story to tell. You know, she would talk to students, faculty members, neighbors, you know, you worked in facilities, it didn't matter who you were. She just took that approach to everyone, and she spent time, and she listened. And, you know, I took that approach with me into journalism. And there's a very, very powerful sort of moment that came when I was covering the White House for NPR. It was shortly after Hurricane Katrina. I was with President Bush, and it was in April of 2006, and so this was less than a year since the storm had hit. And he went to visit a woman named Ethel Williams. She was in her 70s, African American, lived in the upper 9th Ward, and her house was completely destroyed. And so the president, you know, it was a kind of a traditional White House photo op, or it seemed like that. She came out, she welcomed the president into her house. He said, "I'm gonna get you your house back, Mrs. Williams." She said, "What do you do?" "I'm gonna cook you some gumbo and dirty rice." And they got along, and you know, the press took pictures and they hung out for a while. And then we left, and the press and the president, we all made our way back to Air Force One to fly back to Washington. And I spoke to my mother that day from the plane, and you know, told her about what had happened. She had just won this teaching award at Franklin and Marshall, and you know, I talked about coming up and going to Lancaster to see her get the award. And then we took off from New Orleans, landed at Andrews Air Force Base, and I had a phone message that while I was in flight, my mother had suddenly died. And as you can imagine, this day is literally seared in my memory. And so I took time off after that and came back to work. And somehow just my mother's approach to sort of people, and the fact that on this day, you know, was the day that Ethel Williams was sort of brought into my life, was really meaningful. And I had to go back and see this woman again. And so I followed Ethel's story and went back to New Orleans and over the months and sat down with her. And I made a lot of assumptions. You know, here was someone who stood there with the President of the United States and got a personal promise that he was going to get her house back for her. Months and months went by, and that didn't happen. The money through FEMA didn't come in, and she was still living with her daughter across the river. But she felt that in George W. Bush she had a friend. And her faith in sort of the political system and in government was truly inspiring. And we had some really funny moments together. I mean, I sat there in the living room of her daughter's house, and I just said, "Mrs. Williams, I mean, a politician, like who, I mean, some people would say a politician is the last person you should trust in this world." And she said, "What's your name again?" I said, "It's David. Give me your phone number. I'm gonna call you when I get my house back." And I mean, if you looked at poll numbers, you know, if you base things on sort of assumptions you made about politics, here was an African-American woman in a large urban area of the United States, pretty unlikely that she would have supported George W. Bush. And I could have sort of, you know, based my assumptions on that and called it a day. But just listening to her, sort of different strands and nuances of her life came through. And you find surprises when you listen. And it's sad because a eventually, the money actually came through, and Ethel Williams was going to get her house back, and she passed away with cancer before she actually got to move in. But her legacy stays with me, and really always will. And that tells you something about the approach to journalism that I take, and that I really feel like we all take in public radio. And especially in such an unbelievably chaotic media environment and world where we do everything with such speed. I hope that in public radio, what we give to you is the time and space to allow people to tell their stories and the ability to listen. And I'll finish by just telling you about a reporting trip that we did this year. We're coming to a moment when the Supreme Court will probably make a decision about same-sex marriage. And it's an issue that is very sensitive, that is on the minds of a lot of people in this country. And I was having conversations with our editors and producers, and just felt like we hadn't pulled off the whole listening thing that I'm talking about. We had, covered that issue, I think, very fairly. We had different views. We'd had a lot of stories about same-sex couples getting married in places where same-sex marriage was legalized. We had a lot of people who sort of voiced concerns in their opposition to legalize same-sex marriage, but something just felt like it was missing, and we were sort of covering this in a one side versus the other type way, and moving too quickly. And so I pushed really hard for a producer at Morning Edition and myself to travel to North Dakota, which is a state where same-sex marriage is still not legal. And we picked one community and we listened. We listened to a farmer who, believes that same-sex couples should have almost every legal right that they want, but he's not comfortable with the term marriage being applied to them. And we stood there in his field kind of hashing this out together. We spoke to two moms, a gay couple whose baby was refused baptism by a minister 16 years ago. And they talked about that and stood there outside the church with us. We talked to the current pastor of that church, kind of about the struggle that she has about how to approach a child of a gay couple and whether or not to baptize. We spoke to a member of that congregation who remembers 16 years ago this couple having their baby refused baptism and the guilt that she felt about not leaving the church at that moment. We spoke to a business owner in Fargo who believes to the bottom of his soul that homosexuality is a sin. And we listened to him. And the number of gay listeners who wrote in and said it would have been so easy to just dismiss him as a bigot, but it was such a wonderful chance to actually hear someone who has views that are completely different from my own, but to actually hear how human he was in delivering them. And we sat at a dining room table, and this is probably one of, if not the most memorable reporting moments of my entire career, with a young woman who was gay and came out to her family and had written a book about coming out on the North Dakota prairie. And was sitting with her brothers, her mother, her sister-in-laws, and the first 20, 25 minutes we were all having pizza together. She was talking about her life, and we were going around the table, listening to how her family members reacted to her coming out. And one of her sister-in-laws said, I remember the day I found out, and I was like, I love Melanie, I love her. And she's gay, straight, I love her. And then we turned to the subject of same-sex marriage, and the sister-in-law got very, very uncomfortable, and she left the table. And a lot of her family started, sort of talking about her and sort of explaining that she's Catholic and because of that sort of has conflicted feelings about this. And the sister-in-law was off in the corner and was getting so angry that her family was talking about her that she eventually just slammed a door and left. And my editors and I had a lot of conversations about whether to air that sound of her leaving. how to approach this. And because she went to her sister Melanie and said, that I was just sort of, I thought that you guys were talking about me and it didn't make me comfortable, and I thought that it would come across on the air that I didn't support you, Melanie, and that's not it at all. And so we decided to air that sound, but to explain that. And the line that ended that piece, and we thought long and hard about sort of what to say. I said on the air, people can be conflicted about something and still be thinking out of love. And that was the lesson for me in meeting this family and meeting many of the people in North Dakota who we met. And, I'm really proud of the journalism we did. Whatever the Supreme Court decides, it felt like we had captured a moment in this country where not everyone agrees, where a lot of people are sort of figuring this question out on their own. And it's hard. And nothing made me happier than getting responses from people who have very strong views on this issue, but just saying we really valued the chance to listen. And so the more we can do that in public radio, and I think the more we can do that in all of our lives, a lot of the noise will go away. And it's okay to sort of have tough discussions, but to be reminded that we can all get along and love one another. And I just think about the media environment today, and I think about the climate in Washington, and I think we forget that lesson far, far too often. So I will leave it at that, and I'm really eager to take your questions and then sort of talk about whatever you'd like to, but I really appreciate you taking the time to listen, and as I said, it's just a true honor to be here.
Our speaker has graciously agreed to respond to questions submitted in writing from the audience. Cards for you to write those questions have been placed at each of your tables. If you have a question, please raise your card and it will be collected so that David Hunter, program chair for the Akron Roundtable, can present your questions. David?
Thank you. We really appreciate your compelling story about North Dakota and same-sex couples and same-sex marriage. It prompts this question. One of the hallmarks of NPR is its reputation as a factually based, unbiased source of news and information. What can you share with us on the way you handle the inevitable pushback from some corners on that image?
If I hadn't brought up North Dakota moments ago, I think I would share that. Taking an issue that can be so polarizing and literally just listening to people and hearing people talk about their views and how their own views are shaped. I think that's what we try and do every day. Bias is a really strange thing to sort of figure out. Don Gagne and I, when we were covering the Bush White House together, talked about it often, about how we really feel like being fair and balanced is a religion. And if we do not write a script or write a story where we can say that this was fair and balanced, then we're not doing our jobs and we shouldn't come to work the next day. And so the response that I always offer, one is I invite people to sort of read a script, every word of it. And if there's something that they feel is biased, I'd be happy to talk about it. And the other thing that is enormously gratifying is that, while we do have to push back on that sometimes, if you look consistently at survey after survey after survey, people who listen to public radio are divided almost equally between people who consider themselves liberal, conservative, and right down the middle. And that's wonderful, and to know that is really important. But covering the White House for 4 years, you can imagine that once in a while that the question you ask comes up.
We always get great questions from our audience, and this luncheon's no exception. One member of our audience says, I admire the questions which are asked on Morning Edition. Can you describe the process of the research and the writing of those questions?
it really, really varies a lot. I'm almost frightened if any of you came and saw sort of how the show comes together, because it can be chaotic, it can be wild, it can be fun. It's different every morning, and then somehow we put 2 hours of radio on the air. I'll give you both extremes. I could, let me think about this. When the morning that Sonia Sotomayor was nominated to the US Supreme Court, I was pulled into a studio with about 17 seconds notice. And literally, I had a script in front of me, didn't even know sort of where we were in the clock, and said, "This is Morning Edition from NPR News. I'm David Greene. President Obama has just nominated Sonia Sotomayor to the US Supreme Court. Nina Totenberg is on the line, thank God." And I just started asking her, who is this, and what was the president thinking, and what other nominees were there? So it was just a matter of coming up with questions and having a conversation. Oftentimes, if we're talking to a correspondent, one of our own correspondents, and he or she is covering something very specific, they will have worked with an editor, overnight to sort of come up with a draft script of what they want to cover. Now, once we get in the studio and I'm on the line with, Soraya Sarhadi Nelson or Louisa Lim, Lourdes Garcia Navarro, it's, I'll be, I could ask them anything, and we might take it to a different direction, because it's the listening thing I talked about. If you stay too wedded to a script, you're not actually listening to the person talking to you. So you have a draft, you have a script, and you'll have conversations with editors about sort of where you think a conversation might go, but you're sort of thinking on the fly and following where the conversation is taking you.
Not surprised to have this question. What will be the key issues in the next presidential election?
It's hard to predict, and I know I would stand here and say something and then look back on this and say, why in the world did I say that? Because the world has changed. I think immigration is going to be huge, my colleague Steve Inskeep had a conversation this morning with Whit Ayers, who's been big in Republican circles and politics for years, talking about that the Republicans will probably not win the White House if they cannot figure out a way to reach out to more non-white voters. And so I think having an immigration debate is sort of waiting there, and it's going to be really impassioned and fascinating. And I don't know, the big question I have about this campaign, even in moments where the headlines suggest that foreign policy is very prominent, American voters will very often in polls sort of surprise us and say that issues at home, economic issues and issues that sort of affect their lives directly, are much more important to them. But with everything that's happened, ISIS and Russia, I'm very curious to see if more and more Americans are actually talking about sort of wanting to feel safe and picking a leader who makes them feel safe. But I don't know, there's something about this campaign that really seems like personality and personal connection is going to be important. And I look at some of the big names out there. I look at Jeb Bush and Hillary Clinton and others, and I think comfort level and I think real connection with the candidates and how well those candidates are at connecting might play a huge role as much as sort of specific issues.
Your theme about surprises happen when you listen prompts a question like this. Your ability to listen requires your ability to create a safe environment to openly talk. How do you do that, for example, if you wanted to create a safe environment for a conversation with, say, Donald Trump?
What would I tell Donald Trump to make it a safe environment? I don't know if he would feel that unsafe coming into any conversation. I'm not, no, but I treat everyone, even if they, have very recognizable names, with respect. But also I'll sort of explain to them in the same way I explained to everyone, so you and I are here, we're just going to have a conversation. I told Leonardo DiCaprio this. I told, the president of Liberia this. We really appreciate your time, and we're just going to chat. And I'll say it's going to be a back and forth. I don't want you to give a speech because it should be a conversation. But I'm not going to stop you from kind of taking this where you want it to go. And normally, we develop a certain comfort level, and I like being able to kind of disarm people who, especially ones who are very recognizable, because that I think is very important. The studio or being on the line with someone and recording, I want it to feel like we're sitting on a couch or at a dining room table. And I want it to be accessible to the people listening. And I want listeners to imagine themselves sitting there with Leonardo DiCaprio and asking him the questions that you would want to ask. And so whatever I can do to sort of create that safe space and to remind people who may or may not have egos that this is a place where we're just going to chat and be humans.
As you know, we have students that attend these lunches. This question might have come from their table, and even if not, it will certainly benefit them. When did you figure out this career path was for you? What advice would you give to the youth in regards to a career?
I'll say this, that brings to mind the invocation, which gave me chills. So I really appreciate that. And that was very powerful, and a reminder of the importance of a free press. I was in high school and was recruited to be the editor of a high school paper, and hadn't really thought about journalism all that much, but really liked writing, and so became editor of the McCaskey Vedette, which came out every 2 weeks. And we had been getting a lot of complaints. This was in Lancaster, Pennsylvania, and because of safety concerns, a requirement that there was a new school policy that everyone had to wear ID badges. And if you forgot your IDs, you would get detention. If you forgot your ID consistently, you could get suspended. So a lot of students were complaining that teachers were basically playing favorites. And if you were sort of a good student, if you didn't have your ID, it wasn't a big deal. But if you were sort of someone who had been in trouble before, you might get detention or suspended. And so we decided to do an expose on how the ID policy was being implemented unfairly. And it was the front page of the Vedette, and every single student, was reading it that morning when it came out. And that just felt great. And I was called to the principal's office. And he sat me down and he said, "Why are you doing this?" And I said, "Why not?" And he said, "Well, it's making the faculty look bad." I was like, seems to be that way, sir. Yeah, that's what's happening. And he wasn't trying to censor me, but being able to answer his question just so confidently and basically saying that's what the press is about felt awesome. And that feeling has never left.
We have quite a few questions, more than we can ask right now, but we do have time for 3 more questions. How will NPR look, or should we say sound, 5 years from now? What will be unchanged and what will be different, and how will technology play a role in all of this?
It's a really tough question. I will say 6 or 7 years ago, I was getting really nervous and pessimistic about the future of radio, because we were hearing and being reminded, that college students, when surveyed, very rarely do you find one who actually owns a radio, which is not that confidence inspiring if you're in our profession. But the last few years, the younger generation, more than I ever imagined or expected, has seemed to really value sound and storytelling and podcasts and listening to news in a very sound-rich way. And that's taken me from pessimistic to incredibly optimistic. And we at NPR and all of our stations like WKSU are working really, really hard, to be there for the people who are listening the same way they always have, and also to be there for people who want to listen and value sound and value the sense of community that a station like the one here creates, but are sort of listening with new toys. So I think you'll be seeing more things like, the NPR News app, where you can be anywhere and you can click on it and click on WKSU and listen to Amanda in the morning, as if you were still listening on a radio 30 years ago. Our challenge is, to be delivering the sound and the news that we always have, and for all of our stations to be, these important pillars in the communities as they always have, and to stay absolutely true to, our values and sensibilities, all the things that people appreciated through the years of public broadcasting, but to be making sure that we're delivering in ways where people, can still listen. And I'm really, really feeling good about that these days, compared to 5 or 6 years ago when I was getting pretty nervous.
2 more questions. We've had several that have asked sort of about the technical blocking and tackling and putting the show on. And here's one. Is there an on-air dress code for Morning Edition, or do you guys basically do the show in your pajamas?
Wow. So it depends on the shift that you're in. And we have producers and editors who are working only from about 11:30 until about 7 in the morning. And they can wear whatever they want to. Now I will say this is a group that would not come in their pajamas, but you can be a little looser and more casual, which is sort of it's the fun of our show. We're kind of own the building overnight. You're sort of running around this vast building and it's just us. So sometimes, my colleagues have had golf tournaments, through the hallways, which is fun. As for the hosts, it's this alarming moment of transition because we're sort of overnight, and I would rather be in jeans and a t-shirt, but then suddenly we work until 1 or 2 in the afternoon, and if you do that, suddenly the sun starts coming up and the rest of the staff starts coming into the office, and they sort of have different expectations for attire. So I would say we sort of strike a balance. I don't wear the suit that I always did at the White House unless I have a big interview. But I will, I might make it a little more casual. I will say my wife has very strong views about clothing and says that I should always look nice. She has a rule that if I'm ever interviewing a president, I have to be in a suit, no matter what the country is, no matter what. And we were together in Russia, but we were going to interview the president of Estonia on his ranch. And it was 99 degrees that day. And Rose was in this incredibly comfortable sundress. And she had told me that her policy was still firmly in place and I had to wear a suit. So I was in a suit and I said, it's 99 degrees, we're gonna be outside at this guy's house. He might wanna be casual, he might just be hanging out. She's like, he's the president of Estonia. I'm like, got it. So we get there, I am literally pooled in sweat. Just coming down my clothing. And we walk out, and the president of Estonia greets me in a t-shirt, blue jeans, and no shoes. And I looked at Rose, and I think she just mouthed. But anyway, I think we err on the side of looking nice. But you can get away with a little bit more since it's the wee hours in the morning.
We always have a lighthearted final question. You've taught us the importance of surprises of listening, and hopefully we've made you feel comfortable here. It seems that you have been. And we've had a couple questions that said, you're a radio guy. Would you take us out with just a couple of bars of Mandy, please?
Oh Mandy, you came and you gave without taking, but I sent you away, oh Mandy.